to All the F Words,
a podcast where two writer friends, nearly 30 years apart, explore everything we give an F about. I'm Gabby Moskowitz.
And I'm Joanne Green. On each episode of All the F Words, we'll focus on a theme starting with the letter F. Things like frugality, fragility, fishing, and felons.
We'll share stories from our lives and our distinct generational perspectives and look to the experts for insights and ideas.
Today, we're going to talk about feral. What, you say? Feral. It's a word which generally refers to the wildness of animals, right? I'm thinking about feral cats walking around a cemetery.
Well, yeah, usually. But the word feral is sometimes used to refer to people too, which brings to light a very interesting question that I have always been fascinated by. And it's what happens in human development and which is stronger, nature or nurture?
This is a profound question.
Do you have any internet black hole topics, like where you all of a sudden find yourself Googling late into the night or when you're supposed to be doing something else, reading about something? Do you have anything like that you tend to go back to over and over again?
Can't say that I do.
Well, maybe it's just me. I have always been fascinated by the concept. I think from the time I was little, I think probably it started when I saw The Jungle Book. The idea of, well, there are a few different ways to think about it, but the idea of feral children. So have you heard of feral, the idea, do you know what a feral child is?
No, but I think I maybe was one because they always told me things like, it's so politically incorrect now. I can't believe it. But my mom used to say, we're going to ship you back to the Indians. Can you imagine?
Oh, boy. Yeah. Well, so there is a lot of problematic stuff just in some of the myth surrounding feral children. And for the most part, it's been found to be somewhat fictional, this idea of a child who's raised by wolves. I don't know. Did you see, I think it was last year, the documentary Misha and the Wolves?
I did not, but should I?
Well, it's fascinating. It's about this woman who completely fabricated a story about being a child whose parents, a young Jewish girl whose parents were taken away in the Holocaust, and she basically went and lived with wolves. And it was an amazing story, but it turned out to be totally fabricated. She, I think, wasn't even Jewish and definitely did not live with wolves and was not from where she said she was from. But that aside, there has been a lot of mythology, modern and older mythology around the idea of feral children. And we used to think of it as literally children who were raised by animals. Did you ever see the movie Nell?
No, have I actually been in a cave all these years? Because I'm saying no to all your questions today.
Maybe you're the feral child. So basically, it's the idea of a child who doesn't have any human contact, and in some stories is actually raised by animals. What is actually it's very sad and upsetting. What actually tends to be the case in stories of feral children is there are kids who are, for horrible reasons, neglected or abandoned by their parents, and they're found some amount of time, months, sometimes even years later, having survived in whatever way they could. And then the impact of that time is experienced. And so there are a few, I'll share with you a few stories that I found. I just remembered the other thing my mother used to say, and I think it's my parents. I'll give equal credit to my dad on this one. They called me the wild woman of Borneo. I have no idea where Borneo is or if there are wild women there, but it was definitely better than thinking of myself as an animal. At least I was a wild woman. Go on. A wild woman. All right. Well, I assume you've read the book or seen the movie The Jungle Book, right?
Make no assumptions, Gabby. I know it's both Rudyard Kipling and Disney. That's all I can tell you.
Yeah. So it's the story of Mowgli, who's a boy who's, you know, separated from his parents and raised in the jungle, and he kind of lives like an animal. And so there are some stories of it's not clear how true they are, but stories of times that has happened. Um, so let's see. There is a story of
Is this appealing to you because
uh,
you would like to be raised with animals?
well, I think and I'm really fascinated by the question, as we said in our intro, the question of nature versus nurture. And it's a really difficult, like, what has more impact on the development of a person? Is it, is it nature? Is it who they come into the world as? Or is it nurture? Is it how they're raised? And I always think it's interesting. I think one of the best places to get a sense of it's just a really interesting look at whether a child is who they are or whether they are who they're raised by when you see a child who hasn't had human contact. And obviously it's a very sad and upsetting thing when that is the case,
And
but
pretty
I also think
unusual,
it's
I
really
would imagine.
interesting. Extremely unusual. So there's a story, for example, another story from mythology. In ancient Syria, the goddess named Derceto was offended by the Greek goddess Aphrodite. And Aphrodite exacted punishment by using her love powers to make Derceto lust after an underage boy. After she had her way with this, it's very creepy and upsetting. She became pregnant and gave birth to a daughter named, I think it's Semirami. And they sent Semirami out into the wild to die. Um, while Semirami was out in the wild, a flock of helpful doves helped her. And then, as the story goes, the doves take care of this human child, and and she's later found alive and well. Right. So that's not normally that's not really how it actually happens when this happens. So most often, feral children are the result of cases of abuse, where abuse or neglect, where a child is left alone and doesn't learn to speak. And so it's clear from stories like this that the results of a lack of human interaction um, does really terrible things to a child's development. But often they take on, because of the scenarios that they're left in, they learn sort of essential survival um, they through impulse. And I think what I've always been fascinated by is what do we come into the world with versus what do we get from our parents. And that led me to another thing I've always found fascinating, which is twins separated at birth. So are you familiar with the Minnesota twin study?
No, because today I'm
No.
answering no to every single question you ask.
So it took place in 1979. Started in 1979. I actually think it's still going at the University of Minnesota. And essentially, they look at twins separated at birth, and how likely they were to end up similarly. Now, these are not stories of feral children, but it also sort of brings up the subject um, of how we come into the world and who we become. And what they found was the likelihood of twins separated at birth. They found over and over again that twins separated at birth often would find themselves in living totally separate lives in totally different places, but turning out very similarly, preferring, for example, their coffee the same way, having similar tastes in food, having similar interests in career trajectory, that kind of thing. And I have always just been so amazed by the way that we come into the world seemingly with a set of preferences. My mom used to say to me about various things that I just came into the world that way. I've always been that way. And it just seemed impossible to me to believe. But now, since becoming a mom and watching, I mean, now my oldest is 4, and watching the way that she just so clearly has so many preferences that don't seem to have come from Evan or from me, I just find myself continuing to think about it. And so this idea of feral, of like who we are without any, I guess, sort of a positive spin on the word feral, is who we are without any intervention.
Socialization. Yeah.
Exactly. I don't know sort of where to start other than to say, I just think it's fascinating. I just
So
think
maybe
it's amazing.
maybe temperament is something that would be there no matter what. Maybe we can really break down aspects of our personality and our behavior patterns and evaluate which ones would be more impacted by nature and which ones more by nurture. I mean, certainly, I think gender kinds of things. I mean, I really thought before I raised kids that we were so, in general, the reason that girls tended to be more girly, whatever that meant, was because of socialization and because of the messages that they were given. But having raised 2 boys, and you've raised or are raising now 2 girls, wouldn't you say that some of the stereotypical gender stuff just comes with the territory, is just part of
Absolutely. It's
nature?
been, as a feminist, as someone who I am constantly thinking about the patriarchy, and I'm constantly thinking about, and I'm married to somebody who is a feminist, and we're always talking about how can we, model equality and communicate to our kids that they can be whatever they want, and that being a girl doesn't dictate anything. And if you don't feel like you're a girl, that's okay too. It is amazing how it's interesting because I don't know if I've talked too much about this before, but my older daughter, Anna, doesn't like to be referred to as a girl, but she also doesn't like to be referred to as a boy. She's really into animals. I mean, didn't even think about this while I was researching this episode, but she likes to say she's an animal, usually a duck, sometimes a
Dr.
dragon,
Freud would say. Oh, that's an F word.
Freud. Yes. I think we've talked about that before. We should definitely do that. So, I always think it's kind of funny because I am always remembering not to call her a girl, she doesn't even like to be called a kid, she's got these certain words that she prefers us to say, and we try to sort of
like what?
Straddle the line. Like she likes to say, she's fine with saying please, but she likes to say animal please. So she says, animal please, may I have some more milk? And, I'm okay with that. Right now, we're doing one skill set at a time. I'm not going to insist that she say the right thing, right? Like, she's saying please, she gets the intention, that's fine. And I'm always trying to, and she likes to be called Ducky, not Anna. And I feel like that's her prerogative. That's the way the world works. You get to say what you want to be called. And so that's what we call her. So I'm always thinking about that. And despite the fact that she insists she's not a girl, she totally is interested in stereotypically feminine things. And I don't consider myself overtly feminine. Like, I mean, I definitely I identify as a woman, and I wear somewhat feminine clothes, but I'm not pink and girly, and our house is not decorated. It's not like there's tons of pink and purple and glitter and sparkles, but it's like she just gravitates toward it.
Yeah, I just want to say that my boys did as well, because pink is a very attractive color, and sparkles by their nature attract attention. That's what they're there to do. So until boys are told that that's not for them, they are very drawn to that. And so, there are a lot of ways in which this notion of feminine and masculine. And we have devoted an entire episode to this and talking about the difference between being results oriented and process oriented and all of that. But there do just seem to be different ways that many, if not most, girls express themselves and play. Their play is different.
Do you remember when your sons, like, do you remember when they got the idea that maybe glitter and pink and purple wasn't for them? Or did that even happen?
Yeah, it did. It happened in preschool. A lot of this happens in preschool when they're around other kids and they start hearing what other kids are saying, and the opinions of peers become increasingly important. And I would also add that the opinions of peers were more important to our second-born than to our firstborn. Our firstborn was more interested in the opinions of teachers, parents, adults, in general, authority figures, and pleasing them, which I think is pretty standard.
Right. Well, because the second-born, like, when Anna was born, we were her whole world. When Sasha was born, there was another person in that world who she had, whose opinion and approval she was interested in. So that totally makes sense. I think I'm very much the same way. I forget sometimes, my brother came into a world that I had already occupied, and so he cared a lot about what I thought, and it didn't occur to me to think about peers until I was a little bit older. We've talked about birth order in our firstborns episode. And so that is definitely one of those things that is, I guess, in some ways kind of both nature and nurture, I guess you could say it's nurture, because if you were a firstborn and then adopted into a family where you were a younger child, then you would have the experience of being a younger child. But
no, I think that one is entirely birth order is nurture.
Yeah.
It's like it's circumstantial. Right. It's not in your DNA.
Yeah, that's true. Well, then the other component of nature that I think is so interesting is the idea of inherited trauma. And now, have you heard this thing about how you and I have in our DNA, and I have no idea how to scientifically explain it, but I promise this is real. We have because if you think about it, we were an egg in our mother's ovaries when our grandmothers were pregnant with our mothers, right? So we've been present in this matrilineal lineage for quite some time. And so it's a whole thing that, like, the trauma that your grandmother experienced, you were there for it.
And she had plenty.
Was pregnant.
My grandmother. My
As
grandmother left her home because of religious persecution and lack of economic opportunity and went to another country, and they were very poor initially. And so there was plenty of trauma there. And I'm sure that that's somewhere inside me, but there is a lot of talk about that, certainly of descendants of people who were like in concentration camps, things like that they are very much impacted by this in different ways.
And it's both nurture and nature, right? Because it does trauma. We know trauma does change your DNA. It changes the way you experience stress. And when you're coming from generations of trauma, even if the trauma is getting better over time, it's like each generation is raising the younger generation in the throes of their recovery from trauma. So
yes, and as your children get older, Gabby, they will tell you, it's so pleasant, they will tell you all the ways in which you've effed them up by transmitting pieces of, for instance, your parents' trauma onto them. Like, my parents were children of the Depression and very much traumatized by how the stock market crash and the ensuing depression impacted their lives and their choices. And so they really were very much frightened by this notion of scarcity. It was a scarcity mentality. And where's the next buck going to come from? We could lose everything tomorrow. So they raised me with that. And I definitely brought to my adulthood and to my child rearing some of that baggage, which my children have shared has been a burden on them and something they've had to learn how to shed, which, is just the way it works, I think. And then they will create burdens for their children that they will hear about at some point.
Well, there's that old poem that goes, they F you up, your mom and dad. You know that song? You know that one? I want to get it right. Let me just find it. They F you up, your mom and dad. They may not mean to, but they do. They fill you with the faults they had and add some extra just for you. But they were effed up in their turn by fools in old-style hats and coats who half the time were soppy stern and half at one another's throats. Man hands on misery to man. It deepens like a coastal shelf. Get out as early as you can and don't have any kids yourself.
I don't like that. The moral of that story...
Prose.
Yeah, no, a much better idea is to just go get therapy, work it out.
Yeah,
work it
there you go.
out.
That's absolutely, I agree. And then be the end to a bad cycle for sure. I agree.
And then start a new one.
Yeah, Well, that's the thing. It's like it's so crazy making when I find myself. It happens more with my older one than my younger one, but I'm sure my younger one is going to inspire it too. It's like when I find myself triggered, we've talked before about Parenting from the Inside Out, that great parenting book. And when I find myself triggered by something my kid is doing, that it almost feels like I'm out of my body. Like it's some deep, long ignored feeling that I haven't experienced in a long time. And I know that it's my childhood plus my parents' childhood and however many generations are behind us in that moment. And I have to remember to only react to my child, not all this line of people who are kind of invisible behind me or in front of me. And it's just crazy making how many people are in the room when we're trying to take care of our kids, and the way that it all gets triggered all the time. I cannot imagine. I have so much compassion when I think about the generations before me. I was raised by parents who had a real sense of wanting to do things differently. And they didn't always succeed because no one always succeeds. But I know that what the place where they were working from was a really challenging one. And gosh, yeah, I don't know. I think it's really become, I'm so thankful for the way that it's become in style over, like a thing that people are talking about trying to undo old trauma and give our kids the best selves, the best parents that we possibly can. I don't think that was really a trend before.
No, it wasn't conscious. And I think, we keep improving and we keep realizing more about the damage we do. So while it may look like we're doing more damage, it's not, I don't think we're doing more damage. I think we're just aware of the damage we do in ways that we never were before. And we have higher and higher expectations, but every generation should do better than the next. That's the way it's supposed to be. Let's get back to feral children for a minute. Tell me more about what you learned about feral children in reality, not mythology.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure there aren't that many of them, but children who actually are raised by animals. Now I'm fascinated.
Well, so the the stories of the ones raised by animals are fewer and further between. There was a story, I think it was about 10 years ago. It was a malnourished, no, it was in 2015. So not that long ago. A malnourished 2-year-old who was found nursing a, a, a dog or nursing on a dog. And that's really the extent of.
Even I find that gross.
I know. And you love all things dogs. But I think in a moment of sort of thinking about it is kind of gross, but also this was a dog who had the sense to take care of this little child who was hungry and needed something. I think that's kind of amazing. I think in general it doesn't work very well for animals to raise children, and it happens
You're
extremely
kidding.
rarely.
I'm shocked.
but what is much more common, as I said before, is these stories of like, there's a story of a young girl who was found, I think, in the 90s, who's this terrible, terrible story. Her father, he believed she was mentally disabled and he didn't want to deal with her. And so he she was found strapped to a toilet in a basement and had been left there for something like 12 years. And so what happened was, it was an absolutely horrific story. What has been found over and over again in these stories of abuse and neglect and abandonment is that when kids are found and rescued and tried, and it is attempted to incorporate them into society, or try to put them in a more human and humane setting and care for them in a way that we care for modern children, they often can't do it. And so I think this little girl, when she was rescued, was never got comfortable sleeping in a regular bed. She slept, I think, like in a mattress in the corner of a dark room. And there was a story of a little boy who had lived outside, for he was lost in the woods when he was very young and survived for some number of months, and never really, or took a while to get comfortable again. He had grown accustomed to the cold, which I think was really interesting, and so didn't like to bundle up. And so that's an area, like, it speaks a lot to the power of nurture, I think. I think the will to survive says a lot about our inherent nature, but the way that people, and I think that there's a big difference between children who this happens to and adults who this happens to, because adults conclude faster that they are in peril and sort of give up. Whereas I think, even though this is, like I said, extremely uncommon, children tend to adapt a little bit more. So, but it becomes very difficult, even in cases where kids have survived for a long time, very difficult for them to reincorporate into, a modern standard of care. And I think we see a version of that sometimes with, adoption is a really difficult topic. There's been a lot of discussion lately about how even in the best possible scenarios, adoption is trauma. The experience of being removed from, or whether it happens when kids are young or whether it happens when they're older, the experience of going from one family to another, even if the family they're adopted into is better than their first family, or even if they're adopted by really loving people, it still is it's a thing that lives inside of people. So we see the way, similar to the Minnesota twin study, we see the way that people come into the world exactly who they are, and the way that often humans, and I think, you have probably had more pets than I have. When I was growing up, we had cats, we had one dog, but I don't really know what I don't really know too much about like what animals tend to do when you have them, but when anyone comes into a space that isn't where they were born, there's going to be some period of adjustment. And I think in the cases of feral children, for sure, it doesn't always work out. So I don't know.
The
it's
moral
one
of
those
the
subjects.
story is hang on to your kids, raise them indoors, socialize them, and feed the feral cats, right?
Yeah. Well, you sent me when you knew that we were researching this, you sent me that article. So if you want to find the feral cats, they're going to be in Oakland, I think, right?
Well,
Or
they're going to be at
AT&T Park.
stadiums in general. AT&T Park in
Yeah.
San Francisco. They have apparently moved in a very big way to baseball stadiums, and there's some thought that you can't get rid of them, that if you attempt to relocate them, just other cats will come and replace them. So I'm not a cat person.
Uh-huh.
So I don't really know. I am 100% dog. This is why I understand your daughter as Duck. There's this great T-shirt now. I sleep with dogs. I could buy that T-shirt. But yeah, apparently in general, we need to make peace with the fact that animals are out there. And
well, feral cats are such an interesting concept. You know, they're a big issue in lots of parts of the world where there are tons of feral cats, and they're interesting because house cats have been domesticated. They've been intentionally bred to be indoor animals. And so what happens is people's cats have babies, and then what really happens is people don't get their cats fixed. They don't get them neutered, and then they procreate, and then they don't want to take care of the kittens. And so those cats just keep multiplying. But whereas most of the time in the wilderness, the animals that are the species that are being propagated and living outside, those are animals that have been bred and not those are animals that have long been wild, right? And
so they're adaptive.
Right. But it's such an interesting idea, that the idea of domesticated animals, the wild version of a domesticated animal. And I think it's a really interesting parallel to feral humans. You know, the idea of not that humans are, we think of humans as a domesticated species, but in the case of feral children,
not always. So Gabby, you've done this big deep dive into the idea of feral children, and what have you learned? What have you come up with? What are the takeaways?
Well, I think as glad as I am that there aren't actually that many children who have experienced being lost or abandoned by their parents and raised in the wilderness. It's sort of like the Peter Pan fantasy, you know, this idea of Never Never Land, or the Lost Boys, where they're just making it on an island somewhere. But anyone who's read, what's that book called with the pig on the stick? About the boys on the island. Wow, I know.
No, that one I now do know. Now I do know what you're talking about, and can't remember the name of it.
Oh, geez. Okay.
I have an excuse. I am estrogen deprived. You have none.
Well, Lord of the Flies.
That's the one.
Anyone who's read Lord of the Flies knows the live Googling in this episode is really this is a higher percentage this time. Anyone who's read Lord of the Flies knows how Neverland would really work out. But anyhow,
I would eat you.
You would eat me?
No.
You know, we wouldn't just be friends and gather
and die together.
Come on. Come on, we could go fishing or something. So I love that you jumped straight to cannibalism. at the nobody get in a plane crash with Joanne Green. She will eat you right away. So on that note, I think I will probably continue to Google this. I think I had this sort of idea that it was going to be this it's always been something I've been interested in. It's definitely been something that I've spent a lot of time Googling before, and I was a little disappointed is the wrong word, because I'm really glad that there aren't all that many kids who have been separated from their parents in the wilderness. But I think I was sort of hoping that there would be lots of cool stories. Turns out not quite as cool. But I continue to be interested in the idea of nature versus nurture. And I think that I'm coming out on the side of believing that nature is real and exists, but who you are is much more determined by nurture.
And here's what I want to say to all of that. You let me do an episode on frankfurters. I let you do an episode on feral, and we are even.
All right. The democracy, the scales of justice are now even. So we'll get back to our usual menu of episodes.
Thanks so much for listening to All the F Words. You can find us anywhere you get your podcasts. We invite you to follow us and rate us, please. It helps.
We are also on social media. You can follow us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube at allthefwordspod. And email us. We are at allthefwordspod@gmail.com.
Bye-bye.
Bye.